What's going on, guys? It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video, and so I'm going to go over whether or not I think it's worth drafting Travis Kelce in the first round. This is a pretty rare occurrence where we see a tight end going in the first round. There have only been really two occurrences of this happening in recent history. We had 2015 with Rob Gronkowski being drafted in the first round, and then just 2 years ago we had Travis Kelce being a first round pick. I just sort of wanted to take a deep dive into whether or not I think that's a good draft pick, given that you are paying a very real premium for the right to roster Kelce on your rosters this season. Obviously, he would have for sure paid off with this ADP if you were just to have a rerun of last year. So there's certainly the case for it to be made that he could be drafted here and pay off, but also it's obviously a very expensive draft capital. So this is sort of in line with the video I just put out recently as well, reviewing whether or not I think it's worth drafting a top tier quarterback. So if you want to look into the quarterback draft strategy as well, I do recommend you go watch that video, and um, definitely think it'll be worth your time. So yeah, with that, let's just sort of get into it and we can talk about this more. So starting us off with his average draft position, he's currently being drafted at the 106 and is estimated to cost approximately 32.5% of your budget. That's on the ESPN platform. This ADP is across consensus, so no, there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. It's hard to get consensus auction budgets. They're kind of few and far between, but generally ESPN is the best place for you guys to pull those auction budgets, but compare it to your platform for sure. Comparatively, Mark Andrews costs you about 10.5% of your auction budget, and he's being drafted in the third round, going 27th overall. And then the tight end 3 overall by consensus rankings is TJ Hawkinson, and he'll cost you 7.5% of your budget, and he's going in the mid-4th round, around 41st overall. So getting into the projections here, I'm currently projecting Travis Kelce to average 18.2 fantasy points per game this season in PPR formats. He averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game last season, so I'm projecting a slight decline, but really nothing of note. He could easily match the same production he had last season. I am projecting him for 4 points per game ahead of my tight end 2 and Mark Andrews, about 5 points per game ahead of Dallas Goedert, and about 5.7 points per game ahead of TJ Hawkinson. Last season, though, Travis Kelce finishing with 18.6 points per game put him at 5.9 points per game ahead of the tight end 2 and TJ Hawkinson. I think that in general, most people would agree it was a very real down year for a lot of the tight ends last season. We saw Mark Andrews get hurt along with Lamar Jackson getting hurt. Darren Waller got hurt. Kyle Pitts got hurt. George Kittle really didn't come on until the second half of the season. TJ Hawkinson got traded mid-season, so it was tough for him to sustain season-long production. Dallas Goedert got hurt as well. So there were a lot of these top-tier tight ends that did get hurt, and I think that what we're going to see this season is that Kelce's probably going to put up a very similar output to what he did last season, but I also think that the other tight ends are going to see an uptick in production. I think that obviously there's still going to be a very real gap between Kelce and the next tight end, given that I am projecting a 4 point per game gap, which is a massive positional advantage if that's right. But I do think that the gap will be closed compared to last season, despite the fact that I think there's still going to be a pretty significant gap between Kelce and the tight end 2 here. Looking at some historical data, drafting a tight end in the first round, sort of like I touched on earlier, has actually been a pretty historically rare thing in fantasy football. It's only really happened twice in the last 10 years, like I said, with Rob Gronkowski in 2015 and with Travis Kelce in 2021. And referring to some analysis done by a really quality fantasy analyst, someone I listen to quite a bit, in Nick Silak over at thefantasyfootballadvice.com, where he reviewed optimal tight end draft strategy. I'll be sure to link that article he's written in the comments or in the description below, just so that you guys can refer to that as well if you want to dig deeper. But drafting a tight end in the first round does result in a, although moderate, a somewhat significant increase in your expected playoff rate. Teams that drafted Kelce in 2021 and Rob Gronkowski in 2015 made the playoffs at an above average rate. What I will say is that the discrepancy between playoff rate for teams that had Kelce or Gronk those years versus teams that don't was relatively minor, and it's important to note that because it's been so rare, we have such a small sample size on that, and in both of those years, both tight ends performed very well. There was no bust out of those guys. It had Kelce or Gronk gotten hurt in either one of those years, we would be looking at this data very differently. We would see that drafting a tight end in the first round is an absolutely horrible draft strategy, so the small sample size makes it kind of hard to pull from there, but generally what that analysis suggests is that it's more valuable drafting a tight end in that top 5 round area, and then if you miss on that, it's better to wait and draft 2 later on. So I do highly recommend you guys dig into that article as well, but just historically speaking, just wanted to point out that drafting a tight end in the first round does pay off from a playoff advancement standpoint, but it's such a small sample size that it's kind of hard to really garner too much insight from that. So what's my advice? I think that Travis Kelce is one of the safest picks you can make in fantasy this season. He's in all likelihood going to finish as the tight end one, and probably by a pretty significant margin. There's really no new target competition being introduced in Kansas City. We've already seen Kadarius Toney get hurt early on in training camp for the Chiefs. He was somebody that was projected to take a step forward for them. Maybe Sky Moore, maybe Rashee Rice takes a step forward and earns more targets in this offense than we saw last season, but they did lose Juju as well. It's just going to be really clear that it's going to be an offense that goes through Travis Kelce, and then just going to be a bunch of other wide receivers chipping in when they can. So I think that in general, Travis Kelce is going to be super safe. There is a little bit of concern with his age. He's 34 now, but I didn't see any signs last season in terms of him declining. I don't expect there to be any sort of cliff for him as well. I think he's a pretty safe draft pick. But I think it kind of significantly limits your upside. You're drafting him to be the tight end one, and if he doesn't perform at that level, or if he gets hurt, or if Mark Andrews or TJ Hawkinson or one of these other tight ends actually leapfrogs him for that tight end one spot, then you're kind of screwed having drafted Travis Kelce because you spent very premium draft capital and it was supposed to be a sure thing to be the tight end one. And the teams that were able to wait, if the team waited and got Mark Andrews in the third round and he finishes that as the number one overall, then that team's got a huge head start on you in terms of their ability to produce a win this season. So I think that if there are even other tight ends that get closer to matching his production, like I said, I'm currently projecting a 4 point per game gap between Andrews and Kelce. What if that gap is just 1 point per game? Mark Andrews was the tight end one just 2 seasons ago, so it's certainly possible that gap's going to be a lot smaller, and it's going to make it so that the positional advantage there just isn't as great as we're expecting. There are also just a lot of other tight ends that are being drafted later that I love the values on. Like I talked about, I think Mark Andrews is one of the best values in fantasy, being drafted in the third round. And Dallas Goedert as well is one of my favorite values as well. He's being drafted in that 7th, 8th round range, and I've got him as my tight end 3. And on top of that, there's other tight ends late that I like Greg Dulcich. I like Chico Okonkwo quite a bit, David Njoku. Um, a lot of tight ends that go later on that I think are going to be real values this season. So, in general, I think I would recommend drafting a top tier wide receiver in the first round and opting out of drafting Travis Kelce, and then pairing one of those receivers with Mark Andrews or even Dallas Goedert later, just for comparison's sake, just so you guys can sort of see what the difference would look like if you were to draft Travis Kelce and then a wide receiver in the third round versus drafting a wide receiver in the first round and then a Mark Andrews in the third round. You would have the duo of, say, Travis Kelce and Amari Cooper, or you could have Tyreek Hill and Mark Andrews. And for me personally, I would much rather have that latter option where I have probably a top 3 wide receiver this season and then top 2 tight end versus having a top 20 wide receiver and a top 1 tight end. So I think the difference, the teardrop, is going to be really significant between the wide receiver you get in round 3 versus round 1 compared to what you're going to get with Mark Andrews in round 3. So in general, I would just offer or suggest that it's probably not worth taking Travis Kelce this high. I think it's a really safe pick, but the way I generally play fantasy is that I really want to be the team that just takes some risk, and if it hits, I'm going to be the team that wins the league. And I think that drafting Travis Kelce just sort of hurts your ability to do that this season. I do want to add a little caveat that in 10-team leagues or smaller, I actually would switch my opinion in here, and I think that I would certainly target Travis Kelce even as high as number 1 overall. When you get into really small leagues, the positional drop-off at other positions like wide receiver and running back just isn't all that significant. Your rosters are smaller. The teams are there's just less players being rostered, so there's plenty of opportunity to find good players on waivers and later on in the draft. So it's, to me, really important in those smaller leagues to draft high-end quarterbacks and tight ends because you are going to run out of those positions. So just note that if you're in an 8 or 10 team league, then I would definitely prioritize drafting Kelce or at least Andrews. And I'd also, same thing, I sort of touched on that earlier, but drafting quarterbacks as well there. So yeah, that's kind of my advice. I think Kelce's a perfectly safe pick, but in general, I tend to avoid drafting him just because I think it limits your upside. I think they're going to be better values later on. So that'll do it for this video where I look over whether or not I think drafting Travis Kelce is worth your draft pick here. Obviously, I don't want anyone to come away with this from this thinking that I am saying Travis Kelce is a horrible draft pick. He's going to have a great season. I think that he's going to be certainly very valuable in fantasy this season. I just think that you can do a little bit better and there's going to be value elsewhere at the tight end position. So I find myself waiting and not taking him there. But yeah, like I touched on earlier, I also recently released a video going over whether or not I think it's worth drafting one of those top tier quarterbacks. I highly recommend you do go watch that as well. I think it'll really help you guys decide what you want to do in the early rounds here. If this is your first time on the channel, I want to thank you so much for stopping by. I'd love it if you'd want to subscribe to the channel and get more content like this. We're putting out a video pretty much every single day throughout the rest of the off season, and really want to do my best to help you guys win your leagues this season, dominate your drafts, and really want to grow the channel as well. We're sitting around 450 subscribers right now. I'd love to get to 500 by the start of the NFL season. season. So let's see if we can pull that off. We're really on track, and I think we've got a good shot there. And if you did make it this far in the video, I hope you liked it. And if you did, I would appreciate it if you'd hit the thumbs up button. It really helps the algorithm, really helps me know that I'm doing a good job and all that. So with that, I want to thank you so much, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.